So as I mentioned, the text for the sermon this morning is going to be the first 14 verses of chapter 14 of 1 Samuel. And so we're going to look a little more closely at what God's doing in that passage. And brothers and sisters in our Lord, this story, this account of Jonathan and his armor-bearer at Michmash is a great story. It's wonderfully told. It's recounted in such a compelling way that you want to hear the story and you want to hear how it ends. And it's kind of a preview, isn't it, of another famous story in the Bible, the story of David and Goliath. The parallels are quite striking. You have a large Philistine army, a small challenger, an improbable victory, and then an overwhelming defeat of the Philistines. It's kind of like Jonathan is preparing us, pointing us ahead to something more. Now, it also kind of makes us want to know more about Jonathan, because he's sure different than his father. He's like one of those minor characters in a story or a movie, so to speak, where you see them and they're kind of like the scene stealer. You kind of want to know more about their character, and you don't really hear a lot from them. We're introduced to Jonathan in the previous chapter in 1 Samuel 13. He's commanding about 1,000 men, and he defeats a garrison of the Philistines. He actually starts the war against the Philistines. But here in 1 Samuel 14, we hear him speak for the first time. He's really being met, so to speak, by us for the first time. He's just somebody we've kind of heard about, but not met. And what we're going to see as we look at this passage this morning is that he's just the opposite. He's shown in direct contrast to his father. And if you know the story of Jonathan, it's kind of a sadder story. The man who could have been king, who should have been king, who would never be king because of his father, yet being the king his father should have been, showing that he is actually a man after the Lord's heart. All the things that we long to see in the king after the Lord's heart, we see in Jonathan. And so let's look at our passage and we'll get to know Jonathan a little more, and then see also what God's doing through Jonathan and how that speaks to us. So the theme for the message, if you will, is going to be in contrast with Saul. Jonathan shows that he is a man after the Lord's heart. And we're going to see two things with this account. We're going to see his heart orientation, and then we're going to see his aligned actions. And so let's begin. Our text begins, verse 1. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Now, we just read a few minutes ago the verses preceding that. So just to give you some context, the garrison in verse 23 of chapter 13, we're told the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass at Michmash. And then also before the verses that we read, verse 5 and verse 17 of chapter 13, we learn that the Philistine forces were in 4 groups. The main group at Michmash, and then there's 3 raiding parties that have been sent out. And then we also know from the verses that we read that the Israelite army had no swords in order to make sure that the Israelites couldn't rebel against them, and there was no blacksmiths. So the only people in the Israelite army who had swords were Saul and Jonathan. And so what Jonathan's doing is he's planning to go into the heart of enemy territory, to their main outpost, without telling his father, the king. Now, I'm not a military strategist, but it doesn't sound like a good idea. I think pretty much agreed on that. No weapons, just 2 of you, thousands of Philistines, their main camp. Generally speaking, bad idea. So what is Jonathan doing? Now, before we answer that question, we need to look at Saul, and we need to see how the writer of 1 Samuel is presenting Saul. So if you look at what Saul's doing, it says that right afterwards, verse 2, he's sitting in the outskirts of Gibeah. It's in either, the translation's unclear, but he's basically, whatever he's doing, sitting in the pomegranate cave, a place where they produce or take the pomegranates and whatever they do to pomegranates. He's either in that cave or he is sitting under a pomegranate tree. But either way, he's sitting like a king on his throne in his court. And he's got about 600 men with him. But he's sitting like a king, but he's not actually doing anything. He's just sitting there. And then what you see is the author of 1 Samuel then explicitly connects Saul, includes a detail about the 600 men, including, verse 3, Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh. He's being explicitly connected to Eli, to Hophni and Phinehas. Now, if you remember, if you've read through 1 Samuel, if you know the story of 1 Samuel, if you go to the beginning, if you haven't heard it, go to the beginning of the book of Samuel, and the first 4 chapters are going to deal with this family. There is some messed up stuff going on with that family. And Hophni and Phinehas were the ones who said, hey, let's take the ark into battle against the Philistines like a good luck charm. And the ark was captured. And God said to Eli that he's rejecting his line. They're not going to be priests. No one will live a full life. He's punished Eli's family. He's a rejected priestly line. And so Saul has this rejected priestly line with him, a rejected king with a rejected priest. And then we're also told by the author of 1 Samuel that Saul wasn't really relying on the Lord, not using the Lord, the means that God had given to him, to Israel, whereby he would speak to Israel. Because a detail that's given to us is that the priest was wearing an ephod. Now, this was part of the high priest's clothing. And if you've studied this, if you've looked into this, the priest had a whole uniform, and there was this vest kind of thing, and it had a compartment inside it. And the priest would put his hand inside that compartment, and he would take out something called the Urim and the Thummim. And we're not exactly sure what that was. My Old Testament professor did his dissertation on this. He argues that it was a sort of crystal that shone, because Urim and Thummim means light and truth. And so when the high priest would speak, he would speak from God, and people would know it would be authenticated as God truly speaking and not some manipulated opinion of the high priest, because something supernatural would happen when he spoke. So he would put his hand inside the ephod, take out the crystal, and they would inquire of God, and then he would speak. And it's been used, you see that throughout, when they're looking for Saul. Where's Saul when they want to make him king? They say, well, he's hiding in the luggage. The high priest says that with the Urim and the Thummim. So Saul has this with him, and instead of doing anything, he's sitting under a tree or in a cave like a king, doing nothing with a rejected priest and not even relying on the Lord. It's interesting with that ephod, if you read later, if you look at verse, just to give you some extra information or clarity about what the priest was doing. Verse 19 of chapter 14, it says, now Saul was talking to the priest and said, and then as that was going on, there was the tumult in the camp of the Philistines more and more. And then Saul said, withdraw your hand. What happened in verse 18, it says, bring the ark of the Lord. Now, the challenge is that the ark of the Lord wasn't actually with them, right? The ark of the Lord was staying in somebody's field, right? So there's a translation issue here. One of the word for ark and the word for ephod in Hebrew are almost identical. And so what you have is some texts say ark and then others say ephod. And so, but it's likely here, it makes sense when you understand he's wearing the ephod. Saul's like, this is all messed up. Okay, now I'm going to ask God. So he calls the priest forward, and the priest is about to put his hand inside the ephod to get the Urim and the Thummim. And then Saul's like, well, I don't need God's information anymore. Withdraw your hand. You guys follow? So he's not relying on God, he's relying on himself. That's Saul. That's the picture of Saul we're being given. But then you see Jonathan. And so you see his words and his intentions in a new light. He acts in faith. He has a heart after the Lord's heart. And you can see that in verse 6 of chapter 14. He says, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. So Jonathan recognizes, hey, we're just two guys, but that doesn't matter to Yahweh, to the Lord. He can save by many or by few. And it's fascinating to see how Jonathan speaks, because he starts with what you might call a slur or an offensive term for the Philistines, these uncircumcised, these non-Israelites. What he's doing is it's not like a racist thing. What he's saying is he's identifying himself and them in view of a relationship with God, with Yahweh. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant. Jonathan, Israel, was part of this covenant. They lived within a framework of a relationship with God. They lived in the covenant land, Israel. And Jonathan says, that's not them. They don't belong to God, but we do. Let's go over to these uncircumcised. These people who do not belong to God, who are in God's land and oppressing God's people. And so with Jonathan, what you have is this line of separation. He understands who he is. I belong to God. We belong to God. We're different from the other nations, which is in direct contrast to Saul. Why was Saul king? Because the elders of Israel had approached Samuel the prophet and said, we want a king like the kings of the other nations. We want a king like the other nations. We want to be like them. They have kings. We want one. And then they got Saul. And Saul was a king like the kings of the other nations. The line of separation between God's people and the other nations is weak with Saul and with the people, but not with Jonathan. It's strong. It forms his very identity, and it's because of this line of separation, because he belongs to God, the reality of his relationship with God. Think that through. If God is with us, who can stand against us? We say that a lot, but if you really believe it's true, that changes everything. If God is with us, the creator of heaven and earth, Yahweh, then who can stand against us? It's a statement of faith. There's a sense of victory in his voice, in the way he addresses the Philistines, as the way he understands who God is and his sovereignty and who he is to God. It's a statement of devotion to God, recognition that he belongs to God. And then he says these next words, which sound almost fatalistic, but perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Now, when he says that, perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf, he's not resigning himself to his fate. He's not saying, hey, let's see if God will help us. No, what he's saying is, I am submitting myself to the will of God. Yahweh is not required to help him. So Jonathan is not putting himself, it's not like Jonathan swam out, a mile from sea saying, I'm going to drown if God doesn't come send somebody to save me. Let's see if you love me, God. Come on. Where you at? Right? He is not putting himself into a position where he is obliging God to act. He kneels before the Lord and says, you are Yahweh, you are the mighty God, the only God, and you can deliver from anything, and only you can deliver in this moment. And I place myself before you. There's no arrogant presumption that God will help him, in contrast to Saul. In the previous chapter, Saul makes a sacrifice, right? He's told to wait till Samuel comes. But he's waiting and he's waiting. He even waits like the 7 days. And then just before Samuel arrives, he makes a sacrifice that he was not supposed to make. But he makes it because he has this idea that I can't go into battle until I've ticked the box. I got an obligation here. I got to do the sacrifice. And when I do the sacrifice, then God will act. Worship is a form of manipulation. I do good stuff and God does stuff for me. I give, I sacrifice, I perform certain duties, and then God must be good to me. Pagans did the same. Pagan worship was essentially manipulation of the gods. You did certain things to appease them. You said certain words to bind them. Right? You think about magic, why God hated magic so much. What does magic do? It is words spoken that then control the forces of the gods, supernatural, and compel them to do something. That's pagan worship. But Jonathan does none of that. He just kneels before God, recognizes the power of God, and puts himself in position to be an instrument in God's hands. And so when we look, we're going to see Jonathan's actions in a moment, but when you look at his actions, you have to see that it starts with an orientation of his heart. Think that through for ourselves. What does that mean? A lot of you are in difficult moments in your lives. You know, we've been going through a lot the last year and a half, 2 years. Perhaps you've got a lot going on with work, with family, with political. There's just all kinds of stuff going on around us. And you might be faced with life choices that you need to make about, work, career. You're trying to figure out how I'm going to get stuff done, how I'm going to do things. On the one hand, you can say, well, I'm just going to do. I got all these things I'm going to do, and I'm going to show I'm strong. But you have to see with Jonathan, the story is not about doing this and being a hero. It starts with heart orientation, with a recognition of who God is, the sovereignty of God. I don't know what all of this means, but I know he's on the throne. I know he's king. My personal life, my family, COVID, economy, all that, I know it's in his hands. And I rest in him. And I know he loves me. He's the God of the covenant. And I know he's gracious. And I know I'm going to submit to him. And I'm going to rely on him. I'm going to place myself in his hands. Actions matter, our deeds matter, but they begin with heart orientation. When you approach life with a list of do's and don'ts and things you need to do to be considered a hero or to be successful, you end up going to be going wrong. It's humble submission to God. You start with the heart. Love for God, love your neighbor as yourself. An understanding that he loved me first, and I love him. And I want to follow him. I want to do all things through him who gives me strength. And what happens then is there is this peace that surpasses human understanding. Perhaps you've been in moments in your life where you have that. Or you're faced with an illness or a death. Sometimes it might have eluded you. But sometimes you may have experienced it. A peace where you understand God is on the throne. And I don't know what's going to happen. But I know he's good. I know he's in control. And I'm going to follow him. And that gets really real right now. I think when you think of COVID, when you think of all the stuff that's going on around us, we might as well just hit it right in the nose. This is a lot of stuff to be afraid of. And people can be saying, go trust in God. But you can trust in God whatever you do. You can say, I trust in God because I trust that the vaccines will be safe. I don't know, but I'm going to trust them. Or you can say, I trust in God because I don't think I need it. That's fine. That's another argument. But the point is this. This can be used to say, well, just be fatalistic. Just trust in God like nothing's happening. But you have to see the God you follow and to submit your heart to him. What does Jesus say is the fulfillment of the law? To love the Lord with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. My heart beats as his heart does. That means I'm going to follow him wherever I go. My heart's going to beat as his heart goes. And I'm going to love my neighbor as myself. Now, I'm not making a judgment call on any of this, but my point is this. Whatever situation you're in, because everybody's going to have their different opinions, but it starts with trust in God, aligning your heart to his heart, and that makes a massive difference for the way you think of your own actions and the way you relate to others. That you can have differences of opinion, but trust in the same God. And that you can love one another with a heart that beats in tune with his. And then when you look at your actions, they get all flipped around. Because Jonathan's actions are magnificent, but it flows from a heart that's aligned to the Lord's. Jonathan and his armor-bearer, they make their way north to Michmash Pass. It's about a 3-kilometer journey. Now, it's important to note that Michmash strategically is an important city. It's at a junction of roads, and control of Michmash means control of the whole area. There's a reason the Philistines wanted it. There's a reason Saul wanted it earlier. It's important. So what Jonathan's doing here is strategically, there's sort of a brilliance to it, because if Israel has control of Michmash, if they regain control of Michmash, it's a big deal. It's important to understand that Jonathan hadn't turned his mind off. Whatever he's going to look to God to do, he is going to do something. He's looking for God to do something that will turn the war around, and this would do it. And so Jonathan and his armor-bearer, they come to what is called the Wadi Suinit. It's a wadi is like this dried-out riverbed. So what you have in Israel is you'll have the rainy season, and these wadis would become filled with water. And then in the dry seasons, they would just be a gravelly dirt road, and they would be traveled on. So the Philistines and the Israelites would use those wadis, those dried-out riverbeds, as roads. They'd make great roads. And so what happens is, to reach the Philistines, Jonathan and his armor-bearer will climb down the south cliff, Sina, and then they'll go up the north cliff, Bozez. Now, it's an interesting strategy. If it did work, it would be, you'd probably catch the Philistines unaware. There would be a way to do this, just as long as the Philistines didn't see them. Stealth would be critical to this if Jonathan wanted to make it work. I was trying to figure out a way to bring home how this would have looked to the human eye. And I imagine this. This is not historical. This is an imagining. Imagine there was this commander in the army who had a phone, and he was getting reports from a subordinate in the field who was seeing Jonathan and his armor-bearer. And the guy in the field would say, okay, Jonathan and his armor-bearer, J and AB, approaching Michmash from the direction of Wadi Suinit. And then the commander goes, what are they doing? Might be interesting, requires stealth. And then, sir, J and AB have just shown themselves to the Philistines, and they appear to be yelling at them. Sorry, what now? Like the whole thing, what's going on? They've just shown themselves, sir, just getting this in, the enemy soldiers appear to be 20 men. They're taunting J and AB and now have invited them to climb up to Bozez. Climb up Bozez embankment to fight them. And then the commander would go, well, I guess this was just about Jonathan and his armor-bearer taunting the enemy. Just a prank. Kind of a stupid thing for the crown prince to do, but I guess their fun's over. They're going to be coming back. Sir, this just in, Jonathan and his armor-bearer are climbing up Moses. I repeat, they are climbing up Bozez. Now just imagine you would hear that, and you'd be like, it was a silly idea to begin with. They made it worse, and I cannot imagine anything that they could have done which was more dumb right now. That's what somebody would have seen looking at this situation. It's almost comical. But when you look at what's actually happening, when we understand from the perspective of Jonathan, you'll see that the way the situation is perceived is completely changed. The only way they were going to win the battle was if God fought it for them. That was the only way. And so revealing themselves to the Philistines was the only way forward for Jonathan. It was the first step in his reliance on God. We're not going to fight this because we're so good, because we're so clever. Here we are. God, tell us what we're going to do. And that's confirmed by the next thing he does. He places it in God's hands. He reveals himself, and then he says to his armor-bearer, if they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be the sign to us. You notice that he doesn't say, we're going to turn tail and run if they don't say this. No, but what he's saying is, the best thing you would have thought the sign of God's favor would have been if they say they'll climb down to us. That would be the advantageous position. They would be able to fight them coming down. They would be unprepared. To climb up to them and take them would be the silliest thing. I mean, if you've watched the movie, The Princess Bride, you remember, are you going to come on up? He's just waiting for the guy to come and poof. So it's an impossible thing. But Jonathan asks for that as the sign of God's blessing, a sign of victory and assurance for him. And the Philistines take the bait. If they would have seen who was actually calling, you can imagine that little illustration I gave earlier. If a Philistine commander was watching the situation and could actually see who was with Jonathan and his armor-bearer, he would have been crying out, "Don't do it!" But they walk into the trap, so to speak. And the actions of Jonathan and his armor-bearer are significant enough. These two men, they kill about 20 people in an area roughly the size of this church. And then what happens is you see the Lord's actions, which eclipse what Jonathan and his armor-bearer did. The Philistines start fighting against each other with their own swords. They panic and they'll wonder, the Israelites didn't have swords, and now the Lord uses the Philistines' very own swords against them. And so what you have here is the Philistines have walked into what you could call a lobster trap. They have been told to do their worst, and they accepted the invitation thinking that victory was theirs. They didn't realize that climbing up the cliff was Yahweh, that he was with these two men, and there would be no escape. If God is with us, who can be against us? When you think about Jesus Christ and what he did, saving the many by the one. Jesus Christ on the cross, crucified, died for us. But Martin Luther called the cross God's lobster trap for Satan. In this way, that's a very helpful way to see what the cross is all about. Now, the cross, first and foremost, is about Jesus Christ paying the price for our sin, fighting our battle, winning our victory, taking all our sin and shame upon himself, dying our death and freeing us from sin and making us right with God. But within that context, there is this sense of sin and Satan overreaching, of not being able to help themselves, of being invited to do their worst to the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and then accepting the invitation. We have killed him. We have killed the Son of God. Victory is ours. But in that very action, they completed God's plan. They walked in to the trap, and they were completely destroyed and disarmed by Christ. He got into the room, and he locked it, and he defeated death, and he defeated Satan, and he freed us from the grip of sin and Satan. And now he has ascended. He rose from the dead. He defeated the grave. He ascended to the right hand of his Father. He now rules in victory, ruling all things. When you know the end of the story, when you know the true story, it changes the way you act right now. The true story of the world is that there is a God in heaven, and he holds this fallen world in his hands, and that he sent his Son to save us, the one through whom the world was created. And Christ climbed the hill of Golgotha. He died our death on the cross, and we're now his. And as Paul says in Romans 8, if that God is for us, who can be against us? Whatever you're going through right now, whatever turmoil, confusion, despair even, wherever you set your foot, whatever choice you make, whatever decision you make, do it from a heart that is aligned with the Lord's. I'm not telling you what to do, I'm telling you how to do it. Does that make sense? Because I'm pretty sure all y'all here disagree with each other on a whole bunch of stuff. But it is possible for you to still walk in step with each other, following Jesus Christ. That you can place one foot in front of the other. And you can know that at the end of the day, the battle is his. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what God's doing here, but I know he's good, and I know he's won the battle, and that means that every step I take is a step made in victory. That if God is with me, nothing can stand against me. If he's on the throne and I'm going to him, nothing will stand in my way. That I can face concentration camps, I can face the sword, I can face persecution, I can face cancer, I can face death, I can face family turmoil and conflict and whatever else you have with this peace that is almost scandalous. That it's going to be okay because he's with us. Now, in this whole thing, it's important to see the armor-bearer, because as we bring this to a close, the armor-bearer says something. It's a detail that the writer of 1 Samuel included. It's verse 7. If you got your Bibles, take a look. Because the armor-bearer is not just there as kind of like a caddy, you know? Like, oh, sir, looks like about 5 men. The broadsword? It's not like he's just there giving advice on what sword to use. He's fighting, and his actions are with Jonathan. And so Jonathan asks him essentially, and then in verse 7, the armor-bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart, do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul. And literally the Hebrew says, my heart is as your heart is. Isn't that beautiful? My heart is as your heart is. Jonathan's heart follows the Lord. He's a man after the Lord's heart. And then the armor bearer says, my heart is as your heart. That's the way the author of 1 Samuel chose to write it down. It means whatever you want to do, I'm going to do. But my heart is as your heart. My heart beats in tune with the one with whom your heart beats in tune. And what you have as the author of 1 Samuel is giving us this preview of David and the people of Israel. A king after the Lord's heart, a people who follow the king and whose heart is also after the Lord's heart. And even more points to Jesus Christ, a people who have a king who is God incarnate, the Son of God, the very image of God, and a people whose hearts have been remade, conformed to the image of Jesus Christ, whose hearts are as his heart is. It's a beautiful picture. When you look at what's going on here with Jonathan, you want to hear more about him. You want to hear his story, but ultimately his story points you to God, to a heart that beats as God's heart. Actions are evidence of what's in our hearts. And the outworking of your faith is not irrelevant. I want to be clear about that. The heart shows, or the actions show what's in your heart. The call comes to you to hear God speak in this passage, to see the hero of the story who is God, not Jonathan, and to see his heart and to trust in him. As Moses says in Deuteronomy 6, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. As the Apostle John retells us about Jesus, it's Jesus saying to us, follow me. It's the Lord Jesus saying to John in the book of Revelation, to the one who overcomes, I'll give the crown of victory. The crown's already ours. That's the context of your actions in this life. So follow the Lord's heart and act in accordance with his love, trusting him. Amen.